My name is Jaden Coleman, and in 2017, I took my RV up to the remote corners of Cluen National Park in the Yukon Territory. I figured that after years of crunching numbers as an accountant, a little adventure might do me some good. Always the guy behind the desk, I wanted to be the guy behind the wheel for once. The drive was long but breathtaking. Towering mountains draped in glaciers loomed over dense forests, and the air was so crisp it felt like a tonic. I parked my RV at a secluded spot near a pristine lake, the kind of place you'd see on a postcard. It was just me, the wilderness, and a stack of mystery novels I'd been meaning to read. On the second day, I met a fellow camper named Hank, a grizzled old-timer with a beard that could house a family of birds. He was full of stories about the area. "You picked a heck of a spot, Dorian," he said. "Not many folks come out this far. Keeps the riffraff out? Well, except for us accountants seeking thrills," I quipped. He chuckled. "Just keep an eye out for the wildlife. Bears around here have a sweet tooth for city folk." We shared a laugh, and he offered me some freshly caught trout before heading back to his campsite. That night, I cooked the fish over a campfire, feeling more content than I had in years. The stars overhead were so bright, they seemed to poke holes in the sky. The following morning, I decided to hike a nearby trail Hank had mentioned. It was supposedly an old trading route used by First Nations people, rarely trodden these days. Armed with a map, a compass, and my questionable sense of direction, I set off. About an hour into the hike, I stumbled upon something unusual. A series of wooden carvings hanging from the trees. They were intricate, depicting various animals and symbols I didn't recognize. One looked like a wolf intertwined with vines. Another was a raven with outstretched wings. "Local art installation?" I mused aloud. "Banky, eat your heart out." As I ventured deeper, the carvings became more frequent and more unsettling. One showed a human figure with antlers surrounded by flames. Another depicted a face with hollow eyes and an open mouth, as if screaming. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the northern air. Deciding it was best to head back, I turned around, only to hear a rustling in the bushes behind me. Probably just a squirrel on steroids, I told myself, picking up the pace. The rustling grew louder, now accompanied by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. I glanced over my shoulder but saw nothing. The forest seemed denser than before, the trees pressing in like silent onlookers. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out. No response, just the wind whispering through the branches. I continued walking, my casual stroll now a hurried stride. Then I saw it, a figure darting between the trees. Too large for an animal, too swift for a casual hiker. "Okay, Dorian, time to break that personal best in the 100-meter dash," I muttered. I broke into a jog, then a run. The footsteps behind me quickened. My heart pounded in my chest like a frantic drum solo. In my haste, I tripped over an exposed root and went sprawling onto the ground. "Great takedown by a tree's toe," I groaned as I scrambled to my feet. A man emerged from the trees. He was tall and gaunt, wearing tattered clothes stained with dirt. And was that blood? His hair was wild, a tangled mane that framed a face etched with grime and something else. Malice. "Lost?" he asked, a crooked grin spreading across his face. "Just heading back to my campsite," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Beautiful day for a hike, isn't it?" He tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "You shouldn't be here." "Funny, I was just thinking the same thing," I said, attempting a disarming smile. He took a step closer. I noticed he was holding something, a hunting knife, its blade glinting ominously. "Folks around here don't take kindly to trespassers," he said. "Trespassing? I thought this was a national park," I replied, inching backward. "Belongs to those who respect the land," he hissed. I decided then that conversation was overrated. Spinning on my heel, I bolted down the path. Adrenaline surged through me, and for a moment I felt like an Olympic sprinter, minus the cheering crowd and the gold medal. Behind me, I heard him give chase. His footsteps were heavy, but he was fast, too fast. The trail forked, and without thinking, I veered left. Bad choice. The path led to a steep incline strewn with rocks. I scrambled upward, my legs burning with effort. "Can't run forever," he shouted. "Watch me," I yelled back, though I doubted the wisdom of taunting a knife-wielding maniac. Reaching the top, I spotted a dilapidated cabin nestled among the trees. Smoke curled lazily from a makeshift chimney. Maybe someone inside can help, I thought. I sprinted toward the cabin and banged on the door. "Hello?" Is anyone home? I need help. No answer. The door was ajar, and without hesitation, I pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was a shrine of horrors. Animal skulls adorned the walls, and the stench of decay was overpowering. On a wooden table lay various tools, some rusty, others ominously clean. Well, this isn't the cozy cottage I was hoping for, I whispered. A quick survey of the room revealed no weapons, but I grabbed a hefty-looking fireplace poker. Footsteps approached the doorway. Come out, wherever you are, the man sang mockingly. I pressed myself against the wall beside the door, holding my breath as he stepped inside. I swung the poker with all my might. It connected with his forearm, causing him to drop the knife. He let out a guttural yell. No, can't use that word. A deep, rage-filled shout. Before he could recover, I darted past him, knocking over a shelf of jars filled with unidentifiable contents. You're only making it worse for yourself, he roared. I didn't stick around for further discussion. Racing back down the trail, I aimed for a different route, hoping to throw him off. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. Next time, Dorian, maybe stick to beaches and pina coladas, I chided myself as I ran. I stumbled upon a grisly sight. A shallow grave with a partially buried body. The exposed hand was pale and lifeless. Nearby, a backpack lay ripped open, its contents strewn about, a map, a water bottle, and a journal. Swallowing hard, I forced myself to keep moving. The reality of the danger was now stark and undeniable. The trees thinned, and I burst into a clearing where Hank's campsite was supposed to be. But instead of his modest tent, there was chaos. The tent was slashed to ribbons and blood stained the ground. No, not Hank, I whispered. A noise behind me made me spin around. The man was there, his eyes wild, a second knife in his hand. Why are you doing this? I shouted. He grinned. The land demands sacrifice. Look, if it's about the trout, I can catch you another one, I said, desperation creeping into my voice. He lunged at me. Wait, can't use that word. He charged forward, swinging the blade. I dodged, but not fast enough. A searing pain shot through my arm as the knife grazed me. In a panic, I grabbed a metal camping chair and hurled it at him. It struck his shoulder, causing him to stumble. Seizing the moment, I sprinted toward my RV, which was mercifully visible through the trees. My keys were in my pocket, and I fumbled to retrieve them. Reaching the RV, I yanked the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut just as he reached me. He pounded on the door and window, his face a mask of fury. There's nowhere to go, he screamed. Funny, this thing's got wheels, I muttered, jamming the key into the ignition. The engine sputtered to life. I threw it into gear and hit the gas. The RV lurched forward, knocking him aside. In the rearview mirror, I saw him pick himself up. A look of sheer hatred etched on his face. The road was rough, but I didn't care. Branches scraped against the sides of the RV as I barreled down the unpaved path. My hands shook, blood from the cut on my arm staining the steering wheel. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the main road. I drove straight to the nearest town, a small community called Haines Junction. Bursting into the local police station, I recounted everything in a rush, a torrent of words. An officer named Sergeant Billings listened attentively. We've had reports of missing hikers in that area, he said gravely. Sounds like you had a close call. They dispatched a team to investigate. Hours later, they found the cabin, but reported that it had been set ablaze, reduced to smoldering ruins. No sign of the man or the bodies. He's covering his tracks, Sergeant Billings said, but we'll find him. Days later, I learned that the man was believed to be Elias Crowther, a former wildlife guide who went off the grid years ago. Rumor had it he became obsessed with ancient rituals, believing that sacrifices were needed to protect the land from outsiders. In the final sentence of the report I read it stated, Elias Crowther remains at large, driven by delusions that demand offerings to the wilderness he worships. I left the Yukon the next day, the open road ahead, and a newfound appreciation for the predictable dangers of city life. My name is Nora Harris, and I'm 42 years old. I'm a teacher, or at least I was, before the divorce turned my life upside down a few months ago. I decided to take some time off, pack up my RV, and just drive. I thought solitude might help me figure things out, what I wanted, who I was outside the wreckage of my marriage. That's how I ended up at Dogtown, an abandoned colonial settlement in Gloucester, Massachusetts. I'd heard about the place in passing, legends of witches, curses, and cryptic carvings. It sounded like the kind of eerie, offbeat spot that might spark some inspiration for the memoir I'd been toying with. A quiet weekend in the woods, surrounded by history, seemed perfect. I didn't know then that Dogtown was the last place I should have been. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, parking my RV just off an old dirt road at the edge of the woods. The air was crisp, the sky tinged with the warm hues of early autumn. I set up a small fire and sat outside with my journal, jotting down random thoughts as the sun dipped below the horizon. The silence was strange, not the peaceful kind, but heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. The only sound was the occasional rustle of leaves, but even that felt deliberate. I shrugged it off, convincing myself I was just overthinking. That night, the RV heater stopped working. I bundled up in my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the flickering lantern casting jittery shadows across the walls. Sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I heard something or someone whispering outside. It was faint, like the wind carrying voices too soft to make out. My heart pounded, but when I peeked through the window, the clearing was empty. The next morning, I drove into Gloucester for coffee and a bit of human interaction. I ended up at a small diner near the harbor, the kind of place where locals outnumber tourists. That's where I met Edgar. He was sitting at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee and chatting with the waitress. When I mentioned I was camping near Dogtown, his demeanor changed. He turned to me, his weathered face suddenly serious. "You camping out there alone?" he asked. I nodded. "Just me." Edgar frowned. "Dogtown's cursed. Always has been. Witches, they say. Bad things happen to people who don't belong." I chuckled nervously, but he didn't join in. "You're serious?" I asked. "They don't like trespassers," he said, his voice low. "You hear whispers yet? See anyone out there?" My stomach flipped. I thought I heard something last night, probably just the wind. "It's never just the wind," he said. "Mark my words, if you see her—" "See who?" I asked. He didn't answer, just shook his head and returned to his coffee. That afternoon, I decided to explore the ruins of Dogtown. The trails were overgrown, and the air thick with the smell of damp earth. The famous words were scattered throughout the area, each inscribed with cryptic phrases like courage and resist. They were supposed to be motivational, but out here they felt more like warnings. Then I found a boulder unlike the others. Its surface was etched with strange runes, jagged symbols I didn't recognize. I pulled out my phone to snap a picture, but the screen went black. The battery was dead, even though I charged it that morning. As I stared at the carvings, I felt it, a presence. When I turned, I saw her. A woman standing at the edge of the trees, her figure draped in tattered colonial clothing. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow, and she was watching me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out. She didn't move. For a moment, I thought she might be a reenactor or local messing with me, but then she turned and disappeared into the woods without a sound. That night, back at the RV, I couldn't shake the image of the woman. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But as darkness fell, the unease grew. The whispers started again, louder this time. They seemed to echo my own thoughts, repeating fragments of my journal entries. "Why did you stay so long? Why did you give so much?" I bolted upright, my pulse racing. Then I heard it, the sound of scratching against the RV's door. Slowly, I grabbed the lantern and crept toward the noise. When I opened the door, no one was there. But etched into the paint was a symbol, a spiral surrounding a handprint. The next morning, I decided to leave. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine sputtered and died. The RV wouldn't start. I spent the afternoon hiking deeper into the woods, hoping to find better cell service, or at least some answers. That's when I stumbled upon the ruins of an old cabin. Inside, the air was damp and cold, and the walls were covered in more of those strange symbols. On a rotting table, I found a book. Its pages were brittle, filled with cryptic notes and eerie drawings. One illustration stopped me cold. It showed a woman being hanged, her face twisted in agony. She looked exactly like the figure I'd seen in the woods. As I flipped through the book, a shadow passed over the doorway. I spun around, but no one was there. Edgar called me that evening. Somehow, he'd found my number through the diner's guest book. His voice was frantic. "Nora, you have to leave now." "I'm trying," I said. "The RV won't start." "Then walk," he said. "You don't understand. Tammy Younger cursed that land. She's still there and she's angry. She wants what was taken from her." "Who's Tammy Younger?" I asked. "The last witch of Dogtown," he said. "They hanged her for things she didn't do, and she cursed the town with her dying breath. Anyone who trespasses pays the price." That night, the whispers returned, louder than ever. The RV shook, as if something was clawing at its sides. Desperate, I grabbed the book and followed the sound into the woods, as if drawn by an invisible force. The trail led me to a stone circle surrounded by dead trees. The woman, Tammy, stood at its center, her figure glowing faintly in the darkness. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice like wind through the trees. "You are all the same, stealing, taking, leaving nothing behind." "I didn't mean to disturb you," I said, my voice trembling. "I'll leave, I promise." She raised a hand and the ground trembled. Spectral hands emerged from the soil, clawing toward me. I fell to my knees, clutching the book. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "What do you want?" Tammy's eyes burned with malice. "An offering," she said. "Something of value." I had nothing to give. No trinkets, no valuables. In desperation, I tore a page from my journal, one where I'd poured out my deepest regrets about the divorce, my failures, my pain. I held it out, letting the wind carry it into the circle. Tammy hesitated, her expression softening. The hands retreated, and the ground stilled. For a moment, I thought I saw something human in her eyes. Sorrow, perhaps. Then she faded into the darkness, leaving me alone in the hollow. When I returned to the RV, it started without issue. I drove away as fast as I could, the woods swallowing the clearing behind me. Months later, I published my memoir. It was raw, honest, and deeply personal. The book became a success, though I never mentioned Dogtown in its pages. But even now, late at night, I sometimes hear whispers outside my window, and I wonder if Tammy Younger is still watching, waiting for the price I haven't yet paid. My name is Hannah Miller, and I was 29 when this happened. It was the summer of 2022, and I was in Greenbrier Valley, West Virginia, filming a documentary on Appalachian folklore. I thought I knew what I was getting into. A little spooky local history, some beautiful landscapes, and maybe a few nervous laughs from my friends. I was wrong. Dead wrong. It all started with Elliot, my best friend since college. Elliot's a big guy with a soft heart and an even softer spot for ghost stories. He's the one who got me into the supernatural in the first place, which is how we ended up planning this trip to the abandoned Greenbrier ghost tracks. He called it the perfect setting for my project. Elliot's girlfriend, Marcy, wasn't so enthusiastic. She's sarcastic to the bone and has a knack for poking holes in everyone's plans. "Haunted train tracks, really?" She scoffed when we pitched it. "What's next? A seance in the Walmart parking lot?" Still, she came along, probably because she didn't trust us to survive a weekend in the woods without her. Dan and Ruby rounded out the group. Dan's the life of the party, always cracking jokes and pushing boundaries, while Ruby, well, Ruby's quiet, but she notices everything. I've known her for years, and she's got this sixth sense about people and places. It was Ruby who first warned us that something felt off. We got to the tracks late that afternoon. The forest was thick and green, the air heavy with humidity. The tracks were almost invisible beneath layers of moss and tangled weeds. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd miss them entirely. But the locals hadn't forgotten. They called them the ghost tracks because of the Iron Witch, a spirit said to haunt the area. Legend had it she'd been accused of witchcraft and hanged near the tracks in the 1800s. Before she died, she cursed the town, vowing to haunt anyone who trespassed on her land. The legend didn't scare me. It fascinated me. "We're filming history," I said, adjusting my camera as we set up camp. The clearing wasn't ideal. Dan's tent had a broken pole, and Marcy realized she'd forgotten extra flashlight batteries, but it would do. By the time we got a fire going, the sun was dipping below the trees, painting the sky a deep orange. The first sign of trouble came after dinner. We were sitting around the fire, laughing at one of Dan's ridiculous impressions, when the forest went silent. Not gradually, like you'd expect when animals settle in for the night, but all at once, like someone had hit a switch. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just silence. Ruby was the first to speak. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Dan said, grinning. "The sweet, sweet vibe of nature?" Ruby didn't laugh. "Something's wrong," she said. "We're not supposed to be here." Marcy rolled her eyes. "Oh, come on. It's just the woods at night. Stop trying to scare us." But I felt it too, that heavy, oppressive stillness. I tried to brush it off as nerves. I mean, I was the one who dragged us all out here, right? If anyone needed to stay rational, it was me. The second sign came a little after midnight. We were settling into our tents when we heard it. A low, rhythmic hum, faint but distinct, like the sound of an old train engine in the distance. Dan poked his head out of his tent, grinning. "Is that your ghost train?" "Just probably the wind," I said, though my voice sounded thin even to me. "Yeah, right. Wind doesn't go chugga-chugga-choo-choo," Marcy muttered. Ruby sat bolt upright, clutching her sleeping bag. "It's not wind," she whispered. "It's her." I don't know how long I lay there, staring at the tent ceiling, listening to that sound. It got louder and louder, like the train was barreling straight toward us, and then it stopped. Not faded, stopped. I scrambled out of my tent, flashlight in hand, and found the others already outside. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the clearing. "What the hell was that?" Elliot asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," I said, "but we should stay together." Ruby was the first to notice the scratches on the trees. They were deep, jagged marks, like something or someone had taken a blade to the bark. The scratches formed strange symbols, almost like runes. I filmed them, though my hands were trembling so badly the footage probably came out useless. "This is messed up," Marcy said, backing away. "We need to leave now." Dan laughed nervously. "What, and missed the big ghost reveal? Come on, Marcy, it's just some local pranksters messing with us." But Ruby shook her head. "No one's been here in years," she said. "This isn't a prank." The third sign came when Marcy disappeared. She'd stormed off after another argument with Elliot, saying she needed some space. We waited, calling her name, but she didn't come back. Finally, Elliot and I grabbed our flashlights and went looking for her, leaving Ruby and Dan by the fire. We found her an hour later, stumbling out of the trees, her arms scratched and bleeding, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Marcy, what happened?" I asked, rushing to her side. She looked at me, trembling. "I heard you," she said, "calling me, but it wasn't you. It wasn't you." Back at camp, things went from bad to worse. Dan tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes about camping with Casper, but even he couldn't hide how scared he was. Ruby sat by the fire, staring into the flames, muttering something under her breath. "What's she doing?" I whispered to Elliot. "Praying," I think he said. Her grandmother told her about this place. Yost said it was cursed. The attack came just before dawn. We were packing up, ready to leave, when the forest exploded with noise. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, something heavy crashing through the underbrush. And then it hit Dan. I don't know how to describe it. One moment he was standing there cracking a joke. The next, he was flying backward, slamming into a tree with a sickening crack. He screamed, clutching his leg, which was bent at an unnatural angle. "Get him up!" I yelled. But the thing, whatever it was, wasn't done. It circled us, its shadow flickering in the firelight. I caught glimpses of it. Long limbs, pale skin stretched tight over bones, and a face. God, that face. It wasn't human. Ruby saved us. She grabbed a knife from her bag, slicing her palm and letting her blood drip onto the ground. She chanted something in a language I didn't understand, her voice steady despite the chaos around us. The thing stopped, its head tilting like it was listening. Then it vanished. We carried Dan out of the woods, Marcy supporting one side of him, Elliot and I taking the other. Ruby led the way, her bloody hand pressed to her chest. We didn't stop until we reached the road. Days later, I reviewed the footage. Most of it was unusable. Shaky shots, too dark to see anything. But there was one clip that made my blood run cold. It showed me standing by the fire, filming the group, and behind me, in the shadows, was the figure. It was watching us. I haven't been back to Greenbrier since. I don't think I ever will. But sometimes, late at night, I hear that hum again, the sound of a train that doesn't exist, and I wonder if the Iron Witch is still out there, waiting for her next trespassers. My name is Nolan Graves, and in 2017 I took my RV out to the remote stretches of the Yukon Territory in Canada. Being cooped up in an office for years had me yearning for some real adventure and fresh air. I figured a solo trip into the wilderness would be just the ticket to reset my mind. I had always been an outdoor enthusiast, but life's responsibilities kept pushing my plans further down the line. Finally, I decided enough was enough. I packed up my gear, loaded the RV, and set off for Cluen National Park. The idea of vast landscapes and untouched nature was too alluring to resist. The drive was uneventful, filled with the usual mix of truckers and fellow travelers. I made a stop in a small town called Haines Junction to stock up on supplies. The locals were friendly but gave me that look. You know, the one that says, "You're not from around here, are you?" One old-timer at the general store chuckled when I told him where I was headed. "Watch out for the gold," he said with a grin. "Gold?" I replied, raising an eyebrow. "Folks around here get crazy when it comes to gold," he added before shuffling away. I shrugged it off, assuming it was just local humor that went over my city slicker head. With my RV loaded, I continued toward the park. The scenery became more breathtaking with each mile, the kind of beauty that makes you forget about emails and deadlines. I found a secluded spot near a crystal-clear lake surrounded by towering mountains. Setting up camp, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. I spent the day hiking and snapping photos, marveling at how untouched everything felt. That evening, I built a small fire and settled in with a book. The silence was profound, only broken by the occasional rustling of leaves or distant animal calls. As night fell, the temperature dropped significantly. I retreated into the RV, thankful for the small heater I had installed. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard a faint noise outside, like metal clinking. Probably just settling sounds, I told myself. But then it happened again, louder this time. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The cold air hit me instantly, and I could see my breath forming small clouds. Scanning the area, I saw nothing unusual. The RV stood alone under the starlit sky, and the forest edge was shrouded in darkness. "Must be hearing things," I muttered, turning to go back inside. That's when I noticed footprints near the back of the RV, fresh ones that weren't mine. They led toward the woods and disappeared among the trees. A chill ran down my spine, and not just from the cold. I decided it was best to lock up and stay inside for the night. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the windows, and the uneasy feeling from the night before seemed almost silly. I convinced myself it was probably a hunter or another camper passing by. After breakfast, I decided to explore a nearby trail that promised stunning views. About an hour into the hike, I stumbled upon something that made me stop in my tracks, a rusty pickaxe leaning against a tree with a worn leather bag beside it. Curiosity piqued. I approached and nudged the bag with my foot. Out spilled a collection of old mining tools in a small glass vial filled with gold flakes. "Well, would you look at that?" I said aloud. Maybe the old-timer wasn't joking after all. I considered taking the vial, but thought better of it. Last thing I needed was to get involved in someone else's business. As I continued along the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle, but whenever I turned around, nothing was there. Deciding I'd had enough hiking for one day, I headed back to camp. As I approached, I noticed smoke rising in the distance, not from my sight, but somewhere nearby. It seemed odd, given how isolated this place was. Behind the RV, I made a sandwich and tried to relax, but an uneasiness settled in. To distract myself, I pulled out my fishing gear and walked down to the lake. The water was so clear you could see the fish swimming near the surface. I cast my line and waited. "Not biting today, huh?" I said after an hour with no luck. Just then, a voice behind me replied, "Fish around here don't care much for strangers." I nearly jumped out of my skin, spinning around. I saw a man standing a few feet away. He was rugged-looking, with a thick beard and clothes that had seen better days. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said with a crooked smile. "No worries," I replied, trying to steady my voice. "Didn't hear you coming." "I'm used to moving quietly," he said, stepping closer. "Name's Silas." "Nolan," I offered, extending a hand. He looked at it for a moment before shaking it. "Firm grip." "What brings you out to these parts?" he asked. "Just taking some time off work, enjoying nature," I said. He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning me up and down. Not many folks come out here alone. I like the solitude, I replied, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. Solitude's a funny thing, he mused. Can make a man see and do strange things. Well, I should probably get back, I said, reeling in my line. Sure thing. Be seeing you around, he said, that crooked smile returning. I hurried back to the RV, glancing over my shoulder to make sure he wasn't following me. Something about Silas didn't sit right. Maybe it was the way he appeared out of nowhere, or how he seemed to savor each word he spoke. That evening, I decided to keep a low profile. I locked all the doors and windows, drew the shades, and kept the lights dimmed. As the hours passed, I started to feel a bit silly. Maybe I was overreacting. Around midnight, just as I was about to call it a night, I heard footsteps circling the RV. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for the closest thing resembling a weapon, a cast-iron skillet. The footsteps stopped near the door. There was a scratching sound, followed by a low chuckle. My palms were sweaty as I gripped the skillet tighter. Who's there? I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. Silence. Then a whispered reply, just enjoying the night air. It was Silas. What do you want? I demanded. Thought you might like some company, he said. I'm fine on my own, thanks. Funny thing about being alone, he continued. You never know what's lurking around. Leave me alone, I shouted. The doorknob rattled as he tried to open it. Now that's not very hospitable, he said. I backed away, my mind racing. The keys were in the ignition. I could start the RV and get out of here, but what if he tried to block me? I had to think fast. Suddenly, a loud thud came from the roof, followed by the sound of footsteps overhead. My eyes darted upward. How many of them were there? Desperate, I dashed to the driver's seat, tossing the skillet aside. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. Without wasting a second, I slammed it into gear and hit the gas. The RV lurched forward, knocking whoever was on the roof off balance. In the rearview mirror, I saw Silas stumbling to his feet, a look of rage contorting his face. The narrow dirt road was treacherous in the dark, but adrenaline fueled my focus. Branches scraped against the sides as I sped down the path. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the main road, breathing a sigh of relief. I slowed down, but then headlights appeared in the distance behind me. 2 motorcycles, gaining fast. Panic surged. Seriously? What is this, a horror movie? I muttered, trying to inject some humor into a dire situation. I floored the accelerator, but the RV wasn't built for speed. The motorcycles closed the gap quickly. One pulled up alongside me, and I caught a glimpse of the rider, another rugged-looking man, his face partially covered by a bandana. He swung something heavy against the side window, a metal chain. The glass cracked but didn't shatter. Not today, I shouted, swerving the RV toward him. He veered off, losing control and skidding into the brush. The second rider was more persistent. He pulled ahead and tried to block the road. I had no choice. Clenching my jaw, I gripped the wheel and rammed the RV into his bike. He tumbled away as I sped past. Heart pounding, I kept driving until the sun began to rise. I reached a larger town and pulled into a gas station, shaking from the ordeal. I stumbled inside and told the clerk to call the police. Within minutes, officers arrived. I recounted everything, the encounters with Silas, the attack, the chase. They exchanged glances. You're not the first to report something like this, one officer said grimly. Excuse me? There's a group operating in these parts, he continued. Illegal miners protecting their claims. They've been known to intimidate or worse. Illegal miners? Like gold miners? I asked, recalling the old-timer's warning. Exactly. They don't take kindly to outsiders stumbling upon their operations, he said. They took my statement and assured me they'd investigate. Exhausted, I decided to find a motel and get some rest. Later that day, curiosity got the better of me. Using my laptop, I dug into local news and forums. Stories surfaced about missing hikers, unexplained disappearances, and rumors of a shadowy group guarding hidden mines. One article mentioned a man named Silas Harper, a former geologist turned illegal miner, suspected in multiple disappearances but never charged due to lack of evidence. Great. I had a run-in with a psycho prospector, I muttered. I informed the police about what I found, hoping it would help their investigation. A few days later, I prepared to head home. As I was fueling up, I overheard 2 men talking. Another camper went missing up near Cluen, one said. Must have crossed paths with Silas and his crew, the other replied. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't over for others out there. Driving away, I couldn't shake the thought of those still venturing into the wilderness, unaware of the dangers lurking, not from nature, but from those guarding their secrets with deadly resolve. Silas Harper, a man driven by greed, willing to do anything to protect his hidden gold mines, no matter the cost. My name is Grayson Allen, and back in 2018, I took my RV to the dense forests of Olympic National Park in Washington State. After 10 years of juggling numbers as an accountant, I figured it was time to exchange spreadsheets for pine trees. Maybe I'd find out if bears really do prefer picnic baskets. The open road was a welcome change from the monotony of office life. As I drove, the skyscrapers faded into towering evergreens, and the air grew crisp and fresh. I wondered if this was what air was supposed to smell like without the usual hint of exhaust fumes. By late afternoon, I found the perfect spot to set up camp, a secluded clearing near Lake Crescent. The water shimmered under the fading sunlight, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and distant bird calls. Not bad for a city slicker, I thought, patting myself on the back. I spent the next hour setting up, unfolded my chair, fired up the portable grill, and even attempted to fish off the lake's edge. The fish seemed unimpressed with my bait, probably mocking me from beneath the surface. Fine, I'll stick to canned beans, I laughed to myself as the sun dipped below the horizon. I settled by the campfire, enjoying the serenity. The stars began to peek out, more vivid than I'd ever seen. It was humbling. Made me realize how small we are, just tiny specks in a vast universe. Or maybe that was the beans talking. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I secured the RV, double-checking the locks, a habit from living in the city. Climbing into bed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Maybe I should quit my day job and become a professional camper, I mused before drifting off. A loud thud jolted me awake. Groggy, I glanced at my phone. 1:13 a.m. I listened intently. Another thud, followed by what sounded like metal scraping against metal. Probably just a raccoon, I told myself, though my pulse quickened. Curiosity got the better of me. Grabbing a flashlight, I peered out the window. In the dim glow, I saw a figure near the rear of the RV. Not a raccoon, unless they had started wearing jackets and standing upright. "Hey, who's there?" I shouted, hoping to sound more confident than I felt. The figure froze, then slowly turned toward me. The flashlight beam caught his face, a rugged man with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. His clothes were dirty and torn. He stared at me for a moment before breaking into a wide grin. "Evening, friend," he drawled. "Can I help you?" I asked, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Sorry to bother you," he said, taking a few steps closer. "My name's Roy. Truck broke down a mile back. Mind if I use your phone to call for help?" Something felt off. Maybe it was the odd hour, or the fact that there was no vehicle in sight. "I don't have a signal out here," I replied. "Closest ranger station is about 10 miles east." He chuckled softly. "No signal, huh? Mind if I come in and wait till morning?" Then I hesitated. "I'm sorry, but I'd prefer if you didn't. Nothing personal." His smile faded. "That's not very neighborly of you." "Look, I can't help you. Please leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He stared at me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right then. You have a good night." He turned and walked back into the darkness. I waited until I could no longer hear his footsteps before exhaling. "That was weird," I muttered. I decided it was best to move on. I started the engine, ready to find a new spot or maybe head to the ranger station myself. As I shifted into gear, the RV lurched but didn't move. I tried again. Nothing. Stepping outside to investigate, I found the rear tires slashed. My heart sank. This was no coincidence. A rustling sound came from the bushes nearby. I spun around, flashlight scanning the tree line. "Who's there?" Silence, then a low whistle pierced the quiet night. "Looking for me?" Roy stepped out, holding a hunting knife that glinted ominously. "What are you doing? What do you want?" I demanded, backing toward the RV door. He shrugged casually. "Company. It's a lonely night." I bolted inside and slammed the door, locking it. My mind raced. The tires were ruined and there was no cell signal. I needed a plan. A pounding on the door made me jump. "Open up, Felix," he called out. My blood ran cold. How did he know my name? Then I remembered the name tag on my backpack, visible through the window. Go away, I shouted. He laughed. We could have been friends, but you had to be rude. I searched the RV for anything that could serve as a weapon. My eyes landed on a flare gun in the emergency kit. Not ideal, but better than nothing. The pounding grew more aggressive. The door hinges creaked under the strain. Last chance, he warned. I took position at the far end of the RV, flare gun aimed at the door. With a final crash, the door gave way, and Roy stepped inside. Leave me alone, I yelled. He took a step forward. Or what? Without hesitation, I fired the flare gun. The bright light shot across the space, striking him in the shoulder. He screamed as his shirt caught fire, stumbling backward out of the RV. Seizing the moment, I grabbed my keys and prayed the engine would cooperate. The RV groaned but moved slowly forward, riding on the rims. I steered onto the main road, the metal screeching against the asphalt. In the rearview mirror, I saw Roy extinguishing the flames, his face twisted in rage. He didn't give chase, but his eyes bore into me, a silent promise of vengeance. After a grueling hour, I spotted lights ahead, a small gas station, miraculously open. I pulled in. The attendant stared wide-eyed at the damaged RV. Call the police, I blurted out. There's a maniac out there who attacked me. He hurried inside to make the call. Minutes later, the place was swarming with officers. I recounted everything, from the initial encounter to the attack. A search team was dispatched, and by dawn, they had Roy in custody. Turns out his real name was Martin Blake, a drifter with a long history of violent crimes. He'd been eluding authorities for months. An officer approached me as I sipped stale coffee inside the station. You're lucky, he said. We found evidence at his campsite suggesting he was planning something far worse. I didn't ask for details. Some things are better left unknown. They took my statement and offered medical assistance. But aside from a bruised ego, I was unharmed. The RV, on the other hand, would need some serious repairs. As the sun rose, I thanked the officers and arranged for a tow back to the city. So much for my peaceful getaway. Before leaving, the attendant handed me a fresh cup of coffee. On the house, he said with a sympathetic smile. Rough night? I chuckled. You could say that. Next time you want to get away, maybe I'll just visit a park in broad daylight. He laughed. Can't argue with that. Back in the city, life returned to its usual pace. The office gossip, the clacking of keyboards, the overpriced lattes. It all felt different now. Maybe I wasn't cut out for the wilderness, or maybe I just had exceptionally bad luck. One thing's for sure, I've got a hell of a story for the next office party, and perhaps an excuse to avoid camping invitations for the foreseeable future. They say nature is healing. I think I'll stick to therapy.
It all started with an offhand joke. You hear enough bad jokes in my line of work, but this one stood out. It was 2004, somewhere deep in the North Carolina woods, the kind of place tourists don't even know exists. I had been on 100 missions before, but this one seemed simple. Find the locals who had gone missing and bring them back, dead or alive. I joined the Green Berets for the adrenaline, for the chance to do something meaningful. But over the years, that rush started to fade, until that damn joke. Some of the local cops, the ones I was meant to coordinate with, had this thing where they'd whisper around me like they were afraid to say something out loud. One of them, a big guy named Remy, who always chewed tobacco and spat on his own boots, leaned in one night while I was cleaning my rifle and said, "The woods don't like strangers much. They got their own rules. And yeah, sometimes they eat folks who break them." I remember rolling my eyes and grunting something about old wives' tales, but it stuck with me. I mean, I'd been through enough to know that when locals get weird, there's usually a reason. So I took it as a heads up, though I didn't believe in superstitions. Not then, anyway. By the time we got out there, me, Remy, and a few other locals we picked up, the sun was slipping low behind the trees, giving us just enough time to set up a base camp. I didn't like the idea of working with the local guys, especially Remy, who cracked more jokes than a man should, but orders are orders. One of them, Pete, had lived out here all his life. He swore he'd seen bears doing strange things, but I didn't pay it much mind. Bears don't take people whole, and they sure as hell don't drag them away without leaving a mess. Remy, Pete, and I split up to cover more ground. Remy took the creek bed. Pete took the ridge above it. That left me with the thickest part of the woods where the trees leaned in close like a suffocating crowd. I could feel the humidity seeping through my clothes. The air smelled like pine and something rotten underneath. It wasn't long before I found my first clue. A bloody shirt, half buried under a pile of leaves. Like something had tried to hide it, but didn't care to do it right. The thing about finding blood is, it's never a good sign. But this wasn't the splatter of a struggle or the spray you get when something big goes down. No, this was something else. Methodical. I pressed on, radioing Remy and Pete every 15 minutes like we'd planned. No answers, but I could hear faint static, just enough to know the radios weren't dead. It's just that they weren't responding. By dusk, I found more. Pieces of a tent, torn like they'd been shredded by claws, though not the kind you'd expect. No signs of struggle, no trap, just a creeping sense that something was off. Then I found the bones. Not scattered, not chewed, laid out in a pattern. Deliberate, like someone had taken their time setting them out, like a child making a stick figure in the dirt. There was no mistaking it. Human. I cracked another joke over the radio, something dumb about arts and crafts, but got nothing back. The silence sat heavy, but I pushed on. Maybe they were messing with me, trying to scare the new guy from out of town. That's when I heard it. A snapping sound. Low to the ground, like someone or something. Breaking branches. I kept my rifle at the ready and pushed through a thicket. That's when I spotted Remy's body, or at least what was left of it. Slumped against a tree, his guts spilled out like someone had unzipped him. There was no sign of Pete. I didn't get close enough to see much more, because of what stood over Remy's corpse. It looked like a wolf. If wolves walked on two legs, its fur was matted, dripping with blood that wasn't its own. Its teeth, longer, thinner than they should be, gleamed in the dim light. It didn't look right. Didn't move right. My first thought was that maybe it was a man. Some freaky local in a getup, trying to scare me. But then it crouched low, sniffing at the air, and I knew better. This thing wasn't interested in me, at least not yet. I dropped down, hoping the thick brush would hide me. My breath came out in short bursts. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might hear me. I didn't have a clean shot. And this wasn't the kind of thing you wanted to miss. I watched it turn its head, almost like it was listening for something. Then it stood up and started walking toward the trees. Its limbs moved in jerky, unnatural ways, and I got the impression that whatever it was, it didn't belong in a world that made sense. I waited until it was far enough, then crawled back to where Remy lay, took what was left of his radio, and tried to call for backup. Static. Just static. Pete still wasn't responding either. I thought about turning back to camp, but I couldn't leave without knowing what happened to Pete. Maybe he found a way out. Maybe he was just lost in the dark. Or maybe he wasn't. I found Pete an hour later, hanging from a tree, his neck twisted at an impossible angle. Below him, more bones. Some fresh, some old. There was a skull, cracked open like a walnut, and for the first time in my life, I was scared in a way I hadn't been, even when bullets were flying. This wasn't just about some missing folks anymore. This was a burial ground, a damn feeding ground. I've seen death before, but not like this, not methodical, not like a ritual. I radioed again, whispering this time, as if keeping my voice low might make me less real to whatever was out there. My rifle felt heavy, useless, but I kept it clutched in my hands like a lifeline. I needed to find a way back, but then I heard that same snapping sound, closer this time. It didn't come from the ground. It came from above. That's when I saw them. More of those things, climbing through the treetops like giant bats, their limbs twisting around branches like they had extra joints. There were at least 3 of them, but they moved so fast I couldn't keep count. I stayed perfectly still, hoping they'd miss me, but one of them leapt down, landing in front of me with a soft thud, like a cat dropping from a fence. I didn't think. I fired, 3 rounds into its chest. It staggered back, but the thing didn't go down. It shrieked, not like an animal, not like anything I had ever heard. A kind of sound that drilled into your skull and rattled around in your head. But it bled, and that gave me a sliver of hope. I fired again, aiming for its head, and this time it dropped, twitching on the ground like a dying fish. The others noticed. They dropped from the trees, their claws scraping bark as they hit the ground. I ran. I've never run so fast in my life, and I didn't look back, not even when I heard them crashing through the underbrush behind me. My legs burned, my lungs felt like they were tearing apart, but I ran until I stumbled into a clearing and saw the lights of a cabin up ahead. I crashed through the door, slamming it shut behind me. An old man sat in a rickety chair by the fireplace, staring at me like I had just interrupted his dinner. He didn't seem surprised to see a soldier covered in blood, carrying a smoking rifle. He just looked at me, his expression flat, like he was watching a rerun of a TV show he'd seen 1,000 times before. I asked him if he had a phone, a radio, anything. He just shook his head and said, "They come for what they want, and then they leave. Always have." He didn't blink, didn't flinch, just stared past me, like he was looking through the walls. He started talking about the woods like they were alive, about how sometimes the forest decides who stays and who goes. I didn't have time for his riddles. I barricaded the windows, checked my ammunition, and asked him if he knew a way out. He just laughed, this low, gravelly sound that echoed in the small room. "You don't get out, son. You just survive." And then he went quiet, staring into the flames as if that was all that mattered. I watched through the window as the things circled the cabin, their silhouettes barely visible in the shadows beyond the firelight. One of them came closer, dragging something behind it. Pete's body. It left him just outside, like bait. That's when I made my decision. I grabbed a lantern and the last of my ammunition and told the old man to stay inside. He just nodded like he'd heard it all before. I stepped outside, the cold hitting me like a slap. They were waiting, their heads cocked to one side, like they were curious, like they wanted to see what I'd do. I lit the lantern, smashed it against the cabin wall, and watched as the flames leapt up, catching on the dry wood. I figured if I couldn't get out, I'd take them down with me. The fire spread fast, crackling through the walls, but the creatures didn't flinch. They just watched as the flames consumed the cabin. That's when I realized the old man wasn't just resigned. He was one of them, or something like them, part of whatever lived out there in the woods. I shot at one of the creatures, catching it in the leg. It stumbled, but didn't go down. The others lunged. I fought like hell, but they were faster. One of them grabbed my arm, twisting it until I heard the snap. I dropped to the ground, fighting the pain as I clawed for my rifle, but they knocked it out of reach. Then they stopped. One of them let out a high-pitched yelp, and the others retreated into the shadows as if called back. I lay there, panting, my vision swimming. And then I saw it, their leader, standing on two legs, staring at me with something like curiosity. It leaned down close, sniffing the air, and then it turned and loped off into the trees, dragging Pete's body with it. I don't know why they left me alive. Maybe it was some twisted game. Maybe it was their way of letting me deliver the message. But as I lay there, staring up at the burning cabin, I realized what the old man meant. You don't get out. You just survive. And they let you remember. By dawn, a search party found me. They didn't find the old man, and they sure as hell didn't find Pete. They asked me what happened, but I didn't give them any answers they'd believe. They patched me up, got me out of the woods, and that was that. I left without saying a word. I got out, sure. But sometimes I think about Remy, about Pete, about what those things really are. Part animal, part nightmare. Maybe they were here long before us, just waiting for the woods to change back to the way they liked it. And then I heard the final joke from one of the locals, the one that almost made me laugh. Maybe the woods just didn't like your joke, stranger. My name is Brian Patel, and back in 2021, I embarked on an RV camping trip to the remote stretches of Idaho's Sawtooth National Forest. Ever since I was a kid, I found solace in the great outdoors. It's where I feel most at home, away from the hustle of city life and the constant ping of notifications. I had recently purchased a second-hand RV, a bit rusty around the edges, but still reliable. Friends joked that it had more character than horsepower, but I liked it that way. I stocked up on essentials, loaded my mountain bike, and set off with the kind of optimism you get when escaping routine. The drive was tranquil, the kind where the radio fades into the background, and you're left alone with your thoughts. Pine trees blurred past as I navigated winding roads that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere all at once. About 100 miles into the forest, I found a clearing by a serene lake that looked like a postcard come to life. Setting up camp was straightforward. I parked the RV to face the water, propped open a chair, and cracked open a cold beer. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, reflecting off the lake's mirror-like surface. It was the kind of beauty that made you wonder why you didn't do this more often. The first night was uneventful, filled with the comforting sounds of nature. Crickets chirped in a harmonious chorus, while the gentle lapping of water against the shore acted as a lullaby. I fell asleep easily, wrapped in a blanket of stars visible through the RV's skylight. The next morning, I decided to take my bike out for a trail ride. The path was rugged, peppered with roots and rocks that demanded focus, a welcome challenge. About 5 miles in, I noticed something odd, a series of wooden symbols carved into the trees. They were intricate, almost artistic, but gave off an unsettling vibe. One looked like an eye, another like a hand, and others were shapes I couldn't decipher. I shrugged it off as local art, or perhaps markers left by hikers. Maybe someone was trying to be the next Banksy of the wilderness. Still, a joke formed in my mind. If a tree gets vandalized in the forest and no one's around to see it, does it lower the property value? As the day wore on, the trail became denser. The canopy overhead thickened, allowing slivers of sunlight to pierce through like spotlights on a dim stage. I was about to turn back when I stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin hidden behind a curtain of ivy and overgrown bushes. Curiosity got the better of me. The cabin looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. Stepping inside, I was hit by a musty odor, a mix of damp wood and something else, something metallic. The interior was sparse, a broken table, a moldy chair, and strange symbols similar to the ones on the trees etched onto the walls. A sense of unease settled in my stomach. Maybe it's time to head back, I thought. But as I turned to leave, my foot caught on something. Looking down, I saw the edge of a rug protruding from under the debris. I pulled it back to reveal a trapdoor. Now, any sensible person might have left right then, but I've been told that my curiosity could be the death of me. Hopefully just a figure of speech. I lifted the trapdoor, revealing a set of wooden stairs descending into darkness. Using the flashlight from my bike kit, I illuminated the passageway. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the walls worn, with roots protruding like skeletal fingers. At the bottom, the tunnel opened into a larger space, a room lined with shelves filled with jars. As I approached, the contents became horrifyingly clear. Preserved animals, odd specimens floating in formaldehyde, and other things that made my skin crawl. Then I saw them, photographs pinned to a corkboard, images of people, candid shots taken from a distance, hikers, campers, families. My breath caught in my throat when I recognized myself in one of the photos, taken at the lake where I'd set up camp. The caption scribbled below read, "New arrival. Alone." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Jokes aside, this was no laughing matter. I had to get out of there. As I turned to leave, a faint sound echoed down the tunnel, the unmistakable creak of the cabin's front door. Panic surged through me. I doused the flashlight and pressed myself against the wall, listening intently. Footsteps moved overhead, slow and deliberate. Whoever it was, they were dragging something heavy. The sound of metal scraping against wood sent a shiver down my spine. I needed an escape route. Scanning the room, I noticed a narrow passage partially hidden behind a shelf. It was a tight squeeze, but it might be my only way out. I squeezed through, the rough walls scraping against my jacket. The passage led upward, curving slightly until I found myself behind a thicket a few yards from the cabin. Peering through the leaves, I saw him, a tall, gaunt man with unkempt hair and a beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in years. He wore a stained flannel shirt and carried an old axe over his shoulder. He dropped a large sack onto the ground with a thud. Something rolled out, a deer carcass. Relief washed over me momentarily until he pulled out a large hunting knife and began to skin the animal with unsettling precision. There was something methodical, almost ritualistic about his movements. I knew I had to get back to my RV and leave immediately. Keeping low, I moved silently through the underbrush, every snapped twig sounding like a gunshot in my ears. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the trail and mounted my bike, pedaling as fast as I could. The forest, which had seemed so inviting before, now felt like it was closing in on me. Shadows stretched longer, and every rustle of leaves sounded like impending danger. I reached my campsite, adrenaline pumping. Throwing my bike aside, I jumped into the RV and fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I didn't bother securing anything inside. Getting out was the only priority. As I steered onto the narrow road, a figure emerged from the tree line ahead, the same man from the cabin. He stood in the middle of the path, eyes fixed on me. There was no time to stop. I veered off to the side, the RV's tires crunching over rocks and roots. He didn't follow. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him watching me disappear down the road, a sinister smile creeping across his face. I drove non-stop until I reached the nearest town, a small community called Stanley. Pulling into a gas station, I parked and tried to collect myself. My hands trembled as I dialed the local sheriff's office. An officer named Deputy Harris arrived shortly after. He was a stout man with a firm handshake and a skeptical gaze. I recounted everything, the cabin, the photos, the man. He took notes but maintained a stoic expression. "You're not the first to report something like this," he admitted. "We've had a few hikers go missing over the past decade, but we've never found any concrete evidence." "Well, now you have a location," I insisted. "You have to check it out." He nodded. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, I'd advise you to stay in town until we get this sorted." I agreed, though the idea of spending more time in the area was less than appealing. I checked into a small motel, the kind where the floral wallpaper hasn't changed since the 70s. That night, sleep eluded me. Every creak of the building made me jump. Around midnight, hunger got the better of me, and I decided to visit the all-night diner across the street. The place was nearly empty, except for a waitress and a lone customer seated at the counter. I took a booth by the window and ordered a coffee and a slice of pie. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes, gave me a sympathetic smile. "Rough night?" she asked. "You could say that," I replied. The door chimed as another patron entered. Glancing up, my heart skipped a beat. It was the man from the cabin. He looked different, cleaner somehow, dressed in a plaid shirt and jeans. He walked in casually and took a seat at the counter, 2 stools away from the other customer. Was it really him? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I couldn't be sure. I decided to play it cool and not draw attention to myself. The waitress greeted him warmly. "Evening, Caleb. The usual?" He nodded. "Thanks, Margie." Caleb. That was his name. He seemed familiar to her. A regular, maybe? I was mistaken, perhaps. Just a case of small-town residents bearing a resemblance to one another. I overheard snippets of their conversation. "How's the farm?" Margie asked. "Can't complain. Harvest season's been kind to us," he replied. I felt a wave of relief. This man seemed normal, friendly even. Maybe the stress was getting to me, causing me to see threats where there were none. Just then, the other customer at the counter stood up to leave. As he turned, I caught his face, a rugged-looking fellow with a scar running down his cheek. He gave me a nod and exited the diner. Caleb watched him leave, his friendly demeanor slipping ever so slightly. His gaze then shifted, locking eyes with me. A sly grin formed on his lips. "You're not from around here, are you?" he called out. I swallowed hard. "Just passing through," I answered. He picked up his coffee mug and walked over to my booth. "Mind if I join you?" Actually, I did mind, but I couldn't think of a polite way to refuse. Sure, I said, forcing a smile. He slid into the seat across from me. Up close, I could see a small tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve, a series of symbols similar to those I'd seen carved into the trees and cabin walls. Name's Caleb, he offered, extending his hand. Brian, I replied, shaking it. Unusual name. What's got you visiting our little corner of the world? Just some RV camping. Needed a break from city life. He nodded slowly. The forest can be a peaceful place, or not, depending on where you wander. There was an edge to his voice now. The friendly facade was fading. Yeah, had a bit of a scare earlier, I admitted, hoping honesty might diffuse whatever this was. Came across an old cabin. Thought I saw something strange. Strange things have a way of finding strangers, he said, his eyes never leaving mine. Margie interrupted by bringing over his meal, a bowl of chili and a slice of cornbread. Here you go, hun. Thanks, he replied, but his focus remained on me. I decided to test the waters. You ever hear stories about that area? Maybe about people going missing? He took a slow sip of his coffee. Can't say I have, but then again, folks around here tend to mind their own business. Silence hung between us. I felt an urgent need to leave. Well, it's getting late. I should probably head back. He smiled. Of course. Don't let me keep you. I left a few bills on the table and stood up. As I turned to go, he spoke again. Be careful out there, Thaddeus. The woods aren't always as empty as they seem. I hurried back to the motel, every instinct telling me to get out of town immediately. Back in my room, I packed my belongings and decided to drive through the night. As I exited the motel, I noticed a piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper. Unfolding it, I saw it was one of the photographs from the cabin. This one of me, sitting by the lake, circled in red ink. Panic surged anew. I jumped into the RV and sped off, not caring about speed limits or the noise of the engine. In the rearview mirror, I thought I saw headlights turn on and follow, but I couldn't be sure. After hours of driving, I crossed state lines and didn't stop until I reached a large town with plenty of people around. A few days later, I contacted the state police, providing them with all the information I had. They took my statement seriously and assured me they'd investigate. Weeks went by, and I received a call from a detective, Monroe. We searched the area you mentioned, he said. Found the cabin and the underground room. Did you find anything? I asked. Place was cleared out. No jars, no photographs, just an empty space. What about the man? Caleb? Local records show no one by that name matching your description. The diner you mentioned burned down last year. Margie, the waitress, died in the fire. A cold realization settled in. None of it made sense. Determined to find answers, I did some digging of my own. Online forums, local newspaper archives, anything that could shed light on what I'd experienced. I stumbled upon an old article from 1995 about a man named Caleb Foster, a farmer who was suspected of multiple disappearances but was never charged. He died in a car crash 2 decades ago, but that was impossible. I'd met him, or someone pretending to be him. To this day, I don't know who or what I encountered in that small Idaho town. But I do know one thing. Some roads are better left untraveled. It was in 2008, somewhere in the middle of Montana, right near the edge of a national forest no one really bothered to visit. That was the point, though, wasn't it? A place no one paid attention to. My name is Austin Gibson. Yeah, I know. Sounds like a TV detective. But that's where the comparisons end. I wasn't chasing down bad guys in an old convertible. I was a grunt on a mission that wasn't supposed to be written down anywhere. They gave us vague orders: survey a part of the forest, collect data, watch for unusual activity, whatever that meant. Sounded more like a field trip than a military op, and we sure as hell weren't in uniform for this one. The forest was dense, trees twisted and grown wild like the land had a mind of its own. No trails, no clearings, just miles of green swallowing the sky. And when you're deep in a place like that, With the crunch of dead leaves underfoot and shadows creeping in from every angle, you get that prickling feeling, like you're walking into something's living room uninvited. We were a team of 4, all of us in civilian gear. James Chen, a guy with a background in tracking. Think of him as a walking encyclopedia for animal signs. Mario Costa, our medic, always had a dirty joke ready, usually about our moms. And Jan Walsh, the kind of guy who kept to himself but had the best poker face I'd ever seen. You never knew if he was joking or being serious, made him real annoying on a long mission. But he was solid when things went sideways. We set up camp about 12 clicks from the last known logging road in a clearing that barely qualified as one. No fire. Command had warned against it. Night came down fast, the kind that wraps around you and hides everything more than 5 feet away. Chen started in about mountain lions and grizzlies, like we needed reminding. Walsh cut in with a story about a guy he knew who'd been mauled. And then Costa, true to form, made some crack about how none of us would last a day on a dating app. The usual stuff to keep things light. Around midnight, we heard it. A sound that didn't fit. Not the wind, not a branch breaking, but something dragging itself over rocks, like nails scraping against gravel. Chen's head snapped up, his hand already on the rifle we weren't supposed to use unless absolutely necessary. We went quiet, listening, letting the forest swallow us. Walsh motioned forward, and we followed him in a staggered line, creeping through the underbrush. The noise led us to a narrow ravine about 100 yards from our camp. That's where we found the first body. A deer, but not any kind of kill I'd seen before. Its ribs had been pulled apart like someone tried to crack open a walnut and then gave up halfway. But it wasn't just that. Something had gnawed through its spine. Chen crouched over it, poking around with a stick. He muttered something about no tracks, no claw marks, but his voice shook a bit, like he didn't believe his own assessment. We turned back, leaving the carcass, figuring it was just a fluke, a one-off. That assumption didn't last. Not when we found the second one. This time, a fox, gutted and left tangled in the roots of a tree. And not when Costa stumbled upon the third. Something with too much blood for a small animal, splattered across the rocks like someone took a paint can to it. By the third day, we weren't talking much. We knew better than to spook each other. But hell, it's hard to stay calm when every other step you take, you feel like there's someone breathing down your neck. But still, we had orders. Collect the data, watch for anything odd, report back. Except there was no radio signal out there. So we were on our own until we made it back to the rendezvous point. That night, Costa disappeared. 1 minute, he was next to me, making some joke about the lack of cell service. And then he wasn't. We assumed he'd gone to take a leak. No one thought much of it, until 20 minutes passed. Then 30. I called out. Walsh too. Nothing. We grabbed flashlights and fanned out. I found his rifle just lying there against a tree. But no sign of him, no sound. It wasn't like Costa to just wander off. He wasn't the adventurous type. We spent the next few hours searching, but all we found was a smudge of blood on a tree trunk. Not enough to mean anything definite. Just a smear, like he'd cut his hand and touched the bark. Chen said maybe he fell into the ravine, broke something. But we checked there, and there wasn't a trace of him. That's when the dread settled in, thick and heavy. The next morning, we heard a scream. I've heard men scream before in combat when a bullet catches them in a bad spot. This wasn't like that. It came from the east, somewhere deep in the woods. We all froze, listening. Chen's face went pale. He muttered that it wasn't Costa, that it didn't sound like him. We moved toward the sound, rifles raised, hearts pounding like we were back in a firefight. We found Costa, all right, or what was left of him. His body lay face down, half submerged in a shallow stream, the back of his skull missing. But that wasn't what got to me. It was the way his limbs were twisted, like something had tried to pull him apart but hadn't finished the job. Chen lost it, started cursing, pacing back and forth, saying it didn't make sense. Kept repeating that there should have been tracks. But there was nothing. Just drag marks in the dirt that led into the thick trees. Walsh pointed out that Costa's sidearm was missing. That's when it hit us. He'd tried to fight back. Whatever took him, he'd put up a struggle. But it didn't matter. We should have left right then. Forget the mission. Forget the orders. Just hike out and get to the nearest town. But there's a kind of pride that keeps you from doing the smart thing. Maybe it was the training. Maybe it was that unspoken rule that you don't leave a man behind. So we stayed. We buried what was left of Costa under some rocks and pushed further into the forest, following those drag marks. Around noon, we found an old cabin, or what was left of it. Just some rotted wood and a chimney that leaned like it was tired of standing up. Chen went inside, looking for signs of life, but all he found was dust and an old bear trap, rusted shut. We were about to leave when I noticed something carved into the wood near the door. Symbols, almost like the kind you'd find in some backwoods superstition. Not that I believed in that stuff, but they looked fresh, like someone had scratched them in not too long ago. Walsh said we should keep moving, but I could tell he was just as spooked as the rest of us. As we stepped away, I caught a glimpse of something in the trees, a shadow that didn't quite fit, a shape that seemed to shift, then vanish when I blinked. Chen saw it too, and we shared a look. No one said anything. What was the point? We'd all seen it. We'd all seen too much already. No one said anything. What was the point? We'd all seen it. We'd all seen too much already. That night, we set up a perimeter, flashlights and a few makeshift traps. But it was a joke, really. Whatever took Costa wasn't going to trip over some wire and cans. We stayed awake in shifts, but sleep wouldn't have come anyway. Not with that feeling creeping over us like we were being studied. When it came to my turn, I sat with my back against a tree, rifle across my lap, scanning the darkness. That's when I saw it again, just outside the circle of light. Something hunched and wrong. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a cougar. It moved like a deer, but with limbs too long, like it didn't know how they were supposed to bend. It stepped forward just enough for me to catch a glimpse of its face, or what I thought was a face. Too smooth, too human in a way that twisted your gut. I froze, finger on the trigger, but before I could take a shot, it bolted, silent as a whisper, back into the trees. I thought I imagined it. But then, I heard the crash of branches behind me, Chen stumbling out of his position, his face pale. He'd seen it too. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked, and he just shook his head. It came for us before dawn. A shriek cut through the air, and suddenly Walsh was gone. 1 second, he was beside me. The next, there was a smear of blood across the dirt where he'd been standing. Chen and I fired into the dark, not aiming, just shooting, hoping it would scare off whatever the hell was out there. For a second, I thought it worked. But then I heard a crunch behind me. I spun around, flashlight sweeping across the ground, and there it was, dragging Walsh into the underbrush. I fired, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, and the thing dropped Walsh. But it didn't run. It just turned, twisted its neck to look at me. And I'll never forget that. The way it stared, like it was trying to decide if I was worth the effort. Chen charged it, knife in hand. He'd run out of bullets. It swiped at him, sent him sprawling into the dirt, but he got a good slice in, tore open its side. Something spilled out of it. Not quite blood. Not quite anything I could identify. It let out a sound like an animal in pain, but worse. I grabbed Chen, and we ran. Left everything behind. Gear, supplies, Costa's grave. We didn't stop, didn't look back. We reached the edge of the forest just as the sun was coming up. My lungs burned. My legs felt like lead, but I didn't care. I kept dragging Chen along until we finally reached the nearest logging road. A beat-up truck was parked there. Some old guy with a shotgun leaning against the hood. He looked at us, then at the blood on our clothes, and just nodded, like he'd seen it all before. He drove us to a town without asking questions. We didn't offer any answers. They called it a cougar attack when we reported it. Didn't even bother searching for Walsh or Costa. Just shrugged and said, "That's the way it goes out here." But I knew better, and so did Chen. Though he never talked about it again. Didn't even stay in touch. Last I heard, he moved down south, said he needed to be somewhere flat, somewhere open. I went back to that forest once, years later, just to see if there was anything left of the cabin or the symbols on the door. but the place was gone, like it had never been there in the first place. No signs, no ruins, just trees and silence. But every so often, I hear about another missing hiker, another body found, torn open like a fruit. Maybe it's moved on, maybe it hasn't. But whatever it is, it's out there, and it's not done yet. Something that knows we're not supposed to be in its woods. And one of these days, someone's going to find out what it really is. Maybe they'll be luckier than we were, or maybe not. My name's Jeremy Harris, and this happened back in 1999 in the thick pine stretches of Idaho's Payette National Forest. Now, I'm not some storytelling type, but when you've seen what I've seen, it sits with you whether you want it to or not. I've been with the Forest Service for nearly a decade, mostly search and rescue, but I don't really get a thrill out of finding folks lost off the trails. It's just a job, pays the bills and keeps my folks from worrying too much. But this wasn't a typical day at work. The call came in just past noon. 2 teenagers had gone missing around Lake Cascade while hiking, and their mom swore up and down that they wouldn't have wandered off the marked trails. Typical, I thought. Parents always claim their kids aren't the type to take risks, and they end up climbing a cliffside or venturing miles off the paths. I radioed in, grabbed my pack, and met up with my buddy Matt Taylor at the ranger station. We'd handled plenty of search missions together, so we had our system down pat. By the time we started the hike, the sun was a half-hearted glow behind thick clouds, casting a dim grayness over the woods. We headed up the main trail, our boots crunching over the underbrush and fallen pine needles. I remember making some wisecrack about the kids probably sitting by the lake with no cell signal, blissfully unaware of the mini panic they'd sparked. Matt chuckled and responded with something about making up for our overtime with the stash of cold beers back at the station. Just another day on the job, or so I thought. It wasn't long before we hit signs of trouble. About a mile up, we found what looked like a small campsite, scattered granola bar wrappers, a disposable camera, and a dirty sweatshirt lying next to a patch of trampled ferns. But something was off about the setup. It didn't feel like kids were lounging around here. It felt more like someone had run through. The air was heavy, and I could smell this rank, earthy stench that was wrong for the forest. Matt raised an eyebrow at me, like he was feeling it too. We called out a few times, half expecting the teens to stumble out of the bushes, embarrassed and red-faced. But nothing stirred except a few startled birds. That eerie silence filled the gaps where sound should be. I knelt down, trying to get a sense of what had gone down here. There was a sharp imprint in the dirt, something like a claw mark, but wider and deeper than any animal I'd seen in these woods. I brushed my fingers over it, feeling the jagged lines. Whatever made that wasn't anything natural. You seeing this? Jeremy Harris had spotted something farther up, a chunk of what looked like torn fabric caught on a low-hanging branch. It was a piece of a t-shirt, stained dark, likely blood. A chill settled over me then, the realization sinking in. Whatever was out here wasn't just a wild animal. We both knew when to trust our gut, and mine was screaming that we were in over our heads. We pressed on, calling their names, but now every rustle in the bushes had me glancing over my shoulder. About a mile deeper into the woods, we found the first body. It was one of the teens, a boy, face down with his arm twisted under him at an unnatural angle. His body was mangled in a way that no mountain lion or bear would have done. His torso was scratched open, not by claws but by something else, something that seemed to tear rather than slash. Matt stepped back, a grimace on his face, muttering something I didn't quite catch. We checked for signs of life, even though it was obvious we'd be wasting our time. He was gone. Worse yet, the terror etched onto his face told us this was no accident, no animal mishap. It was a hunt. We radioed back to the station, giving as calm a report as we could manage. They told us to stay put, that backup was on the way, but Matt and I exchanged a look. Sitting still in the woods with God knows what lurking around? Not likely. We agreed to find higher ground and keep watch until help arrived. But something told me that wouldn't be enough. Just as we started back toward a nearby ridge, we heard a faint sound, a low, uneven clicking, like stones scraping together. It was rhythmic and unnatural, like it had intent behind it. Matt raised his flashlight, sweeping it in a wide arc. I followed his beam, and for a moment we saw nothing but trees and shadows. Then, between two thick pines, a shape appeared. It was unlike anything I'd seen, like a mix between a lizard and something much larger. It moved low to the ground with a long, scaly body and limbs that looked almost human in shape, though bent and twisted in a way no human could ever walk. Its skin was dark and rough, patched with what looked like scales. But the strangest part was its head. Elongated, with a wide, flat mouth and jagged rows of what I can only describe as crocodile-like teeth. Matt and I froze. The thing paused, raising its head as if it sensed us. Then, with a sharp hiss, it lunged forward. I didn't have time to think. My instincts took over, and I yanked Matt to the side just as it shot past us, swiping the air with a clawed arm. We bolted up the ridge, tripping over roots and rocks in our haste. But it was on us, relentless, snapping its jaws and thrashing through the underbrush with every step. I remember yelling at Matt to split off, hoping to confuse it, or at least buy us some time. He hesitated, but the look on my face must have convinced him, and he veered off to the left. I dove to the right, dodging trees and scrambling up a small incline. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the forest, tearing at anything in its path. There was no mercy, no pause. It was like it had locked onto us, hungry and unyielding. I lost track of Matt in the chaos, my mind racing as I looked for any place to hide. I spotted a small crevice between two rocks and dove in, pressing myself flat against the earth, hoping it would lose my scent. But then I heard the unmistakable sound of Matt's scream, cutting through the forest. It was short, choked off, and I knew he'd met the same fate as the teenager back at the campsite. The clicking sound grew fainter, and I dared to lift my head. My legs were numb, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. But the forest around me was silent again. I stayed hidden for what felt like hours, watching the trees, waiting for any sign of movement. When I was sure it was safe, I crawled out, my legs unsteady, and started the long trek back to the station, alone. When I returned to the ranger station, the backup was just arriving. They looked at me like I'd gone mad when I tried to explain what happened. They asked about Matt, and I told them the truth, as much as they would believe. We went back out to search, but we only found remnants, torn pieces of clothing, broken branches, drag marks leading deeper into the forest. No sign of Matt, no bodies. Nothing to prove what we'd seen, except my own word. Months later, I did some digging, trying to find any hint of what that creature was. Local legends spoke of a predator, something that roamed these woods centuries ago, rumored to be a guardian or a curse, depending on who you asked. They called it the El Cow, a name whispered by those who claimed to have seen it before vanishing into the wilderness. They said it only showed itself to those who dared to encroach on its territory, too far, too boldly, as if it needed to remind us that we were still trespassers here. That creature, it wasn't just hunting, it was sending a message, loud and clear. The road into the Boundary Waters was a frozen ribbon through a sea of snow, the trees standing like silent sentinels under heavy blankets of ice. The RV's heater hummed steadily, but even that couldn't keep the biting cold out. I was deep into the wilderness now, the place I'd picked to spend a week. Just me, the frozen lake, and the stillness of winter. I'd been coming to places like this for years, ever since the accident. The solitude was the only thing that seemed to quiet my mind. This time, I was here to ice fish, maybe snap a few photos for my nature blog, but mostly I was here to prove to myself that I could still handle it. The cold, the isolation, the memories. I pulled the RV to a stop by a small frozen lake I'd scouted on a map. It was miles away from the nearest town, completely off the grid, just how I liked it. I stepped out into the icy air, my breath fogging in front of me as I took in the sight. The lake was a vast white expanse, the ice thick enough to drive on, stretching out into the distance where the trees disappeared into a blur of white. Perfect. I set up camp quickly, parking the RV near the shoreline and gathering my gear for ice fishing. The cold had a way of creeping into your bones out here, but I didn't mind. I was used to it. I grabbed my auger, trudged out onto the ice, and started drilling a hole. The sound of the blade biting into the ice echoed through the stillness, sharp and harsh against the quiet of the wilderness. Then I heard it, a deep, low rumble that seemed to come from beneath the ice. I paused, the auger still in my hands, and listened. The sound came again, a low, distant vibration like the ice shifting far beneath the surface. I'd heard ice groan before. Anyone who spends enough time in the cold knows the sound of a lake adjusting to the freeze, but this was different. It was deeper, longer, almost like something was moving down there. I brushed it off and kept drilling. By the time the hole was ready, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow. I set up my fishing gear, lowered the line into the icy water, and settled in to wait. The cold crept in quickly, even through my heavy coat, but I was prepared for it. I'd done this 100 times before, and the routine was comforting. But that sound, the rumble beneath the ice, kept creeping back into my thoughts. As night fell, I lit a small fire near the shore, the flames flickering weakly against the chill. I sat by the fire, staring out at the frozen expanse of the lake. The stars were starting to appear in the clear sky above, bright and distant. Then I saw it. A light, faintly flickering and coming from beneath the ice. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe the moonlight hitting the ice in just the right way. But as I watched, the light moved slow and steady, as if something was drifting beneath the surface. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it was still there, faint and regular, like a lantern swaying beneath the ice. I stood, my heart pounding in my chest, and walked toward the lake. The light seemed to pulse, growing brighter for a moment, then dimming again, always moving, always just out of reach. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or a reflection of something from the sky. But deep down, I knew better. There was no one else out here, no one who could be moving under the ice. The rumble came again, louder this time, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. I took a step back, suddenly feeling exposed out there on the open ice. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I turned back toward the RV, my mind racing. The light, the sound. Something wasn't right. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back out onto the lake, determined to make sense of it all. The sun was barely up, and the cold was more biting than ever. As I walked, I glanced back toward the hole I drilled the day before. Something was off. There, by the edge of the hole, was a long, jagged crack running across the ice. The crack hadn't been there yesterday. It snaked out in a jagged line, as if something had pressed up from below. I knelt down, running my gloved fingers along the crack, feeling the cold seeping through the ice. The surface felt thin, too thin for the middle of winter. Then I noticed something glinting just beneath the ice. I leaned closer, peering into the crack. At first, it looked like a piece of metal, rusted and sharp, lodged beneath the surface. I reached into the cold water, pulling it free. It was old, jagged, like part of a machine, but there was no reason for it to be here. The nearest road was miles away, and there hadn't been any mining or construction in the area for years. The metal was strange, sharp and smooth, like it had been cut clean. As I held the piece in my hand, the rumbling came again, louder now, closer. I stood quickly, scanning the lake. The light was back, faint but steady, moving beneath the ice, closer than before. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat break out under my coat. Something was down there. Something was moving. I backed away from the crack, my mind racing. The metal, the light, the sound, it all pointed to something beneath the ice. Something unnatural. But what? The stories I had heard over the years about strange things beneath the frozen lakes, about disappearances and creatures buried deep in the ice, came flooding back. I'd always dismissed them as nonsense, campfire stories to scare the newcomers. But now, standing there in the middle of the frozen lake, I wasn't so sure. I needed answers. Later that day, as I was gathering more firewood, I came across an old ice fishing shack near the edge of the lake that looked abandoned. But there were fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the door. Curious, I approached, knocking lightly before pushing the door open. Inside, I found an older man hunched over a small stove, warming his hands. His face was weathered, his beard streaked with gray, and he looked up at me with tired eyes as I stepped in. "Didn't expect to see anyone out here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The man grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Not many come this deep into the wilderness." I hesitated. "I've been hearing strange sounds under the ice, and I saw a light last night, moving beneath the surface. Do you know anything about that?" The man's expression darkened. He turned back to the stove, staring into the flames. "You shouldn't be out on that lake," he said quietly. "There are things beneath the ice, things that shouldn't be disturbed." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding. The man sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. "There's an old mining operation under that lake, abandoned long ago. They were digging deep, too deep. Some say they woke something up down there. Ever since, strange things have happened. People go missing. The ice breaks when it shouldn't. And that light, it's not the only thing that moves down there." A chill ran down my spine. "What's under there?" The man shook his head. "I don't know. But I've been coming out here for years, and I've seen enough to know when something isn't right. The lake's alive. It's watching you." That night, the light beneath the ice returned, brighter than before, pulsing like a heartbeat. I watched from the RV, my breath fogging up the window, as the rumbling beneath the ice grew louder, more insistent. I knew I couldn't stay. Whatever was beneath the lake, it was waking up. I packed my gear quickly, throwing everything into the RV. But as I started the engine, the ground beneath the RV began to tremble. The rumbling was almost deafening now, vibrating up through the frozen earth. I glanced out toward the lake, and my blood ran cold. The ice was cracking, long fissures spreading out from the center of the lake. And then, in the distance, the surface of the ice exploded upward, a massive shape breaking through. I only caught a glimpse, something dark and enormous, sliding beneath the ice again, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. But it was enough. I floored the gas pedal, the RV lurching forward as I raced away from the lake, the sound of cracking ice echoing behind me. The road was a blur, my heart pounding in my chest. But even as I drove, I could still feel it, the weight of something massive beneath the surface, watching, waiting. When I finally reached the main road, the rumbling stopped. But the memory of that thing beneath the ice stayed with me. I'll never forget it. The way the light pulsed, the way the ice cracked as if it were alive. I left the boundary waters behind, but a part of me knows I'll never truly escape it. Some things should stay buried. And whatever's beneath that lake, it's not finished yet. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as if the forest was holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I'd heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps, one locals swore disappeared and reappeared as if it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it, film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera, set it up, and filmed a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore are fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground. its surface covered in spiraling symbols that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving. The trees closed in tighter, and the trail became fainter, more overgrown. Soon, it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping the camera rolling, but after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment, there had been a clear path. Now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me, alone, in the fog. "Okay," I muttered, "you've dealt with worse." I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, not mine. I froze. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. "Hey," I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. "You lost too?" The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. "I've been walking for days," he said, his voice hoarse. "The trail, it keeps changing." "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. "No one's okay out here." I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path. It's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave." I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look, I have a GPS," I said, pulling it out. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get this guy some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago would be choked with brambles. When I looked back, trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees. Thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate?" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked Eli. He nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us." The forest, I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around like he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers grew louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen. Shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal, the mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me, and I had a feeling it was waiting somewhere in the mist for me to return.